Hello, hopefully y'all can hear me now. I am Desideraggio, going to be running our virtual walk through Oakledge Park. I graduated from UVM a couple years ago with a forestry degree where I minored in geology. I'm also the staff naturalist over at Petrocliffs Climbing Gym Mountaineering School, and I'm also a Vermont Master Naturalist. So I'm really excited to take y'all through this walk. I would prefer that we would be in person outside, as I love going around and running these as a more informal kind of question and answer, walk around. You ask me what a tree is, I talk about what the tree is. But for today, just put any questions you have in the chat and we'll try and kind of stop along the way and address those. All right, so hope everyone is cozy at home, get your cup of coffee. We are going to start with this beautiful photo of the entryway to Oakledge. So if you've ever pulled on in, you'll know that the beach is to the right and the road continues to the parking lots to the left. But this is the first view of the lake that you get from Oakledge. I figured it was a good slide to start with. Here we go. So the landscape is what we're going to talk about first. We're going to start from the bottom up. We're going to talk about the different influences, and I've broken it down into 3 categories. So there's the geology influences, how the rock formed. There's the hydrology influences, which is how the rock was changed over time and how the lake has changed over time and how it's affected the greater landscape. And then on top of that, there's also the human action. So the humans have we humans have operated in a much smaller time scale than the geological and hydrological changes on the landscape. But they're definitely still worth noting, and there's a lot of interesting history. And one thing that's great about Oakledge is they have a lot of informational signs that kind of tell you about the history and provide photos. So I've included some of those photos, but we're going to continue talking about the natural features first. So in simple terms, for the geology, the bedrock was created. The minerals within that bedrock were determined by the parent material, which is the sediment that the bedrock came from. And due to the mineralogy and the formation process, the bedrock gained characteristics that affected the way it weathers. And weathering is just erosion or degradation of rock into soil. And it's also kind of what shapes the landscape that we see today. So after the glaciers, that's, a lot of ice, a lot of frozen water on the landscape, all that water eventually had to melt as they receded. And the Lake Champlain region had a very dramatic series of hydrologic changes. And those further carved out the landscape via erosion mainly. And then the humans have controlled succession, and we've developed the land for our various uses. And we've facilitated new ecological value, using the area as a place to educate the urban community about the real natural world outside. And when I say succession, this is something we'll talk about later. It's basically when you cut down a forest, all you have is the grass and the stumps, and slowly the different plants grow up in a certain order, and we call that succession. So essentially, if you keep mowing your lawn, you are putting succession on hold because you're preventing your lawn from growing into the forest that is around it, and that's providing seeds and providing diversity other than your grass. All right, so here is the timeline of the geology and the hydrology that we've been talking about. And I apologize, this is a lot of information. I'm just going to try and front load you with it, and hopefully we can have a good understanding of it to continue on. But we're going to start a long time ago, 500 million years ago, at the Iapetus Ocean. So this was a warm, shallow sea that was on the land that we are on currently, but it was actually all the way down by the equator because the continents were in a completely different arrangement. And at the bottom of this ocean, the quartz, like sand, and the calcium-rich sediment, which is from like the shells and bodies of sea creatures, it collected at the base of this ocean. And over a long period of time, you can see our next time dot on our timeline is 18,000 years ago. So over that long period of time, The sediment turned into sedimentary rock and then was metamorphosed under heat and pressure into quartzite. And we're going to learn more about that, but it's a really hard rock, rich in calcium. And yeah, that's the Iapetus Ocean. So moving on, 18,000 years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet. This was what we call the most recent ice age. Vermont was under roughly 2 miles of ice, as was much of northern New England. Then we're going to jump forward just a little bit further now, not quite as big of a jump, but 13,500 years ago, the ice sheet began to retreat. And when I say retreat, I mean it melted on the southern margin. So basically, it was almost as if it was moving north as it retreated. The lower boundary was retreating north. And as it did that, there was a lot of water and glacial outwash that needed to go somewhere. So a lot of it filled the basins of New England. So if we think of Lake Champlain as a big valley, right, and we think of the hills that go out to Richmond as a small boundary, and then we think of the next largest boundary, that's actually the Green Mountains. So Glacial Lake, Vermont was several hundred feet deeper than Lake Champlain currently is, and it's extended from the Adirondacks high peaks to the Green Mountains. So quite a large lake. And as the ice sheet was retreating, it kind of spent like a couple thousand years, 2,000 years maybe, slowly lingering at the Canadian border. And as it was doing that, it actually provided the northern cap to Glacial Lake, Vermont. So Glacial Lake, Vermont is capped at the Canadian border on the north, capped at the Adirondacks on the west, and then capped at the base of the Green Mountains on the east. So definitely a different lake than Lake Champlain. Now, 12,000 years ago, the ice dam melts, and it actually led to a really strange phenomenon called the Champlain Sea. So the weight of that ice dam on the Canadian border, on the, well, what is now the Canadian border, it actually depressed the land because it was so heavy. And because the land was depressed, it allowed water from the Hudson Bay, salt water, to come into Lake Champlain, as well as the sea creatures that came with it. So we have a ephemeral Champlain Sea because the land was depressed, it became salt water, beluga whales, other marine animals entered the region. It's part of the reason that we have some marine wildlife on some of our beaches. There's a couple like beach grasses and stuff, and we've also found beluga whale skeletons, I think in like Shelburne or Jens or something. So that explains the whale tails on the highway, if you've ever noticed those. But it's also just a cool fact to share about your home area. But I said this Champlain Sea was ephemeral because eventually the land began to lift back up. So the weight of the glacier, the weight of the ice sheet just sunk down the land. And then as it left, like once the ice sheet melted, the land was still depressed, allowing the salt water to come in. But over 2,000 years, the land slowly remembered where it used to be. And it's called geological uplift. And it actually cut off the seawater. And the lake has slowly transitioned to freshwater, and its sea level has gone down, I believe, another 100 or 200 feet from the sea level of the Champlain Sea. So that's a lot of information, but just real quick, different bodies of water. There's the Iapetus Ocean 500 million years ago, 13,500 years ago, Glacial Lake, Vermont, and then Champlain Sea shortly after, and then that was a pretty short-lived little sea, and it turned into Lake Champlain. That's the important stuff. Hopefully y'all got a little bit of the complicated stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that bedrock. This is one of the ledges that you see at Oakledge. All of the beautiful green is lichen. It's really aesthetically pleasing. Has a good contrast against the like dark purple color of the weathered quartzite. So this is the Moncton Quartzite Formation. As I mentioned before, it's a fairly hard metamorphic rock. And when I say hard, I mean it's difficult to break. It kind of breaks off in little chunks. It's not like a lot of the schist or like the shale that we see around here. You can kind of go to sections of the wall, grab a chunk and peel a little bit off. And the Moncton quartzite does not really work that way. So it was previously sedimentary sandstone. So think about all the sand and all of the calcium carbonate that's in the sediment at the bottom of the oceans, and it gets compressed together, becomes sandstone, eventually gets turned into metamorphic rock. And the calcium-rich presence is due to the marine animals from the Champlain Sea. So here's like a side profile of some more of those ledges. And this is a really great shot. You can kind of see that it's a little bit on an angle. This tells us a story of the landscape and how it changed as the sea level was dropping from Glacial Lake Vermont to Lake Champlain today. So the sea level did drop, I believe, like 600 feet, 500 feet over 500 feet to over 4,000 years. And you know, we've all heard of like the 1,000-year storm. There's at least 4,000-year storms that happened in that period of time. And this is just like a big weather event that caused a lot of like waves to rush up against the edge of the lake. And that's the theory for why we have this stair-step landscape, why these ledges have been eroded away. You can see that the landscape, the path you go down is on a slope, and all the way up, there are all these little like stair-step features. And this can actually be seen all around the shore of Lake Champlain. So if you think about it, if you go down to the waterfront near the Echo Center, it's pretty flat down there right off the water. And then you have to go up College Street a little bit to get to Battery Street, and then it flattens out a little. That was likely a little bit human-made just so that the road could go in there. But then you go up another steep hill, and then it flattens out, and then another steep hill. And just for context, UVM, I think, is like 400 feet in elevation or something. So UVM would have likely been on the top of the hill, a tiny little island. Maybe the campus would have been underwater, but some of the tallest buildings would stick out during Glacial Lake Vermont. Likely UVM was a larger island during the Champlain Sea, and now it's completely out, and as is the rest of Burlington. But yeah, just a cool thought to think about as you're walking up those steep hills. Think about the 4,000-year dramatic history of the water just washing up large storms, causing major erosion events. After the glaciers, all of the sediment on this hillside was really loose. A lot of this, the bedrock was there underneath, but as the glacier left and all of the outwash from the glacier poured across the landscape, it kind of blanketed all the bedrock with a sediment that we call glacial till, which is just a mix of a bunch of things. So these really soft slopes were easily eroded by these really large storms. So in the more recent past, humans have also influenced this environment. If you've ever been to Oakledge Park, you have likely seen this awesome tree fort. It's on a big white oak, and it has this beautiful little zigzag path to get in. I really enjoy this spot. It's so large. It's fun to kind of hang out with a group of friends. There's like a branch in it you can sit on. And I just thought that was a good photo to introduce this next section. So we're going to be talking about humans, and we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the first humans to use this landscape. So pre-European settlers, the Abenaki tribes, used the Champlain Valley region for all sorts of different activities. They were hunting, they were fishing, they were gathering food. There's a lot of trees and shrubs around here that have edible berries and nuts. They're planting corn, beans, and squash, and they were managing the forest to some degree with limited fire and as well some selective cutting. And I just like this photo for a little bit of context. It's kind of like, oh, look at the fog over the lake. That's where the canoes went. Yeah, I don't know. It's also important to note that the lake was really important for the tribes to kind of travel. So we didn't have I-89, we didn't have the highways and the road infrastructure, and they sure didn't have cars back then. So the lake really was the form of travel throughout all of the Vermont and the now New York region.
Love that picture. That's such the ice buildup in the little bay. That's great.
I also, if you like looking at ice, I think ice is a beautiful ephemeral art. Go to Oakledge because this bay just gets battered And you can see it's not a particularly frozen lake at the moment, but this bay just has all these chunks. And in the crusty, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in the crusty snow down here, there were actually tons of little fragments of ice that had just been thrown up onto there. So it looked like a pile of glass. And I couldn't get a photo of it because it was too fine, but definitely a beautiful spot to go ice hunting. All right, so some more human landscape history. I got a bunch of great photos online from the UVM Library Special Collections, as well as a few photos that I kind of took photos of from the informational plaques that they have down there. If you're interested in history and the history of the settlement of Burlington in this region, I definitely recommend taking the time to walk around Oakledge and check out all of the informational signs. They have some beautiful old photos. So in 1973, European settlers started a farm and a shipyard in South Cove. And if you're familiar with the main path down to the water, the wide path that leads to the big tree and that cove we just saw a photo of, South Cove is to the left of that, to the south, and it is actually now private property. But at the time, Oakledge was a part of a much larger property that also encompassed red rocks. So you can still go down there and look to your left. You'll see some housing and docks, but you'll also see the cove that originally had ships in it. And I don't know how old this photo is exactly, but you can see a ship in the cove. And I believe we're going to see another photo of that. I think it's that same pitch pine later. We'll see. And then in 1883, the Webb family bought the property and built a mansion on it. And you may know the Webb family's name from Shelburne Farms. They actually came here first. They thought this would be a great property for their homestead, started building, lived there for a bit, eventually found Shelburne Farms, decided that they wanted to get away from the city a little bit. And I believe the older parts of the Webb family moved out there and started developing that farm. And this was kind of passed on through younger family members as a property that they still own for quite some time. So then in 1930, the Webb family subdivided the property. Red Rocks was purchased by someone and then later turned into its own park. All of the housing in between Red Rocks and Oakledge was all split off. I don't know if it became housing quite then, but that was when the property that we know as Oakledge got its kind of more formal boundaries.
Someone pointed out that it's a typo. It should be 1793 European settlers, not 1973.
Ah, you know,
yeah,
that is a typo. Thank you for that. I said that and I thought it sounded a little funny. Appreciate it. But anyways, this Oakledge Manor flyer is kind of an interesting series of old photos here. And there's tennis, which we can still do today. I think they're playing croquet or something, or it's horseback riding. It's just a kind of a series of photos as an advertisement for Oakledge Manor Resort. So that was fairly popular in the early 1700s. Just kidding, 1900s. I apparently don't know the difference. And then in real 1970s, the resort was actually sold to the city of Burlington to turn it into a park. And this is pretty exciting because the park that we know today. But you may notice that we have all these chimneys around, and those are actually the remains of the cabins that were built along the ledges for the manor and the resort. So we see these old photos, and you can kind of imagine this is an opposite perspective of that same cove that I showed y'all before. You can see the ledges. It's a lot more cleared. There's more of those like large pines, not much understory. And I'll get more into this later, but essentially when we look at a forest like this, we can see that the landscape was cleared fairly recently. So an older forest that hasn't had much management is usually going to have more layers of structure. So we just see really one type of tree. They all look about the same age in terms of their diameter and their height. So we kind of can tell that this was cut down. The pines were allowed to grow up, and everything else was managed around it so that the people could have like a nice area to walk through as they go from cabin to swimming to golf or whatever you're playing. And we still have their chimneys today. And the reason that we have the chimneys left and not the rest of the buildings is because shortly before the manor was sold to the town of Burlington, the resort, they actually were short on cash, and they were paid by the Burlington Fire Department to like use all of the structures as a test fire place. So this beautiful manor and resort from the 1800s got burned down. All these little cabins got burned down. And it kind of provides an interesting landscape clue for us now, but I think anyone who's really into history who would have appreciated seeing those buildings is probably feeling it right now, because it's definitely a little sad that we lost that just because they needed a little money before selling the place. However, these chimneys are still used today. I have often gone down there and seen people making fires and having a little sunset hangout and cooking with them. So it is good that they still are serving some use. So we've been showing a lot of these old photos and new photos. I had a lot of fun with this, especially because throughout the time scale that seems really large to humans, a lot of the trees have actually been there the whole time. So one tree in particular is this very large oak. It's a white oak. It's right down by the water. So we can see there's a boat in the water, but to the left of that boat, to the south on the lake, is South Cove. And there's this kind of lump here is like another, I don't know if this was attached to a building ever. It kind of looks like more of an outdoor stove area, but really cool spot. And this is the tree today. And I zoomed out, I just had to stand back because I wanted to get the whole tree. So it doesn't look that much bigger, but it's definitely like at least 100 years older. And it's a really magnificent tree. And you can still see that the fireplace is there. And there's actually a plaque on the stone next to this tree that says that this tree was living here at the signing of our Constitution. So if seeing these 3 photos of the same tree didn't make you think that these trees have seen a lot and been around, this plaque hopefully will convince you.
Oakledge.
Yes,
Oakledge.
Well, I'm getting there.
Yeah, right?
It's not called Oakledge for no reason. So in some places, humans have held this succession of the landscape for over a century. And this, in the photo on the left, I think here over here, photo on the left, you can see that same oak that we just took a photo of, or took a couple photos of. And then in the photo on the right, the branches that are hanging over the image are actually from that tree. So the perspective is a little skewed. I couldn't get on a boat in South Cove because it's private property and it's winter. But I tried my best to recreate the photo. And essentially what we're looking at here is just that this path that goes up to where the manor used to be, where the pavilion now is, has been cleared. It's been grassland. Well, I don't know if I'll call it grassland, but it's been managed to be an urban open space filled with grass for at least 100 years. Who knows how long? Maybe since the first settlers cleared their way down to the shipyard. But it's an interesting thought, just because it shows the impact that humans have had on the landscape. I'm sure that all of the trees on either side of this grassy area have been dropping their seeds in there, hoping that they'll grow up. And the humans have said, nope, we want this to be an open walkway for humans. So that's just, I think that's a clear example of how we humans hold succession and how we take a landscape and just make it our own in a way. Make it serve our functions, I guess I should say. So this is another area that likely was cleared a long time ago. So this meadow has no other established trees. A few small ones growing in. We'll talk about those in a second. And this red cedar is pretty proud. It's a slow growing tree, so although it may not look that big, it's likely like 80, 100 years old. Hard to really guess without checking the rings, but it's definitely a lot older than any of the shrubs and other small trees in this meadow. And red cedars are often passed over by most grazing livestock, so it's fairly common to go into old pasture land and see no trees except for a few like slightly larger cedars. So that's what I'm thinking. Who knows when this land was cleared? It's kind of this big meadow in a flat area right next to where the Oakledge Manor and Resort would have been. But it also could have been cleared even earlier if Native Americans were using this area for its proximity to the lake. We don't really know, but we know it's cleared now, and that's what being a naturalist is all about. It's just looking at the clues in front of us and getting creative and trying to figure out a couple different theories and speculate on how it could have come to look the way it does. So we are actually taking part in changing this meadow. So today we have this sign that I took a photo of. You can kind of see my shadow taking the photo, which I thought was an artsy effect. And it says that this is a no-mow zone. So it's really great that Enjoy Burlington, or Burlington Parks Rec and Waterfront, are trying to use this as an educational space. Essentially, they're acknowledging that it's not providing much wildlife function in its current state. They're saying that if they let the grass grow, let the shrubs grow, plant some trees, they're going to increase habitat for insects, as well as for the birds that eat those insects and the birds that nest in these shrubs. They're going to save energy and reduce CO2 emissions just because they're going to have all of the trees there, and the trees will also be, shading things. They're going to promote sustainable landscapes for a healthy lake, so less runoff if there's more forest, and they're going to create more of an environment for observation and learning. I think those are really awesome goals for any kind of urban landscape. I think I appreciate going into the woods where there are no signs and no, plaques and signs of humans. But I think our urban landscapes, especially the ones that are right here in the heart of Burlington, they take a lot of use and a lot of love from a lot of people. And it's really important that people are not just going out there and enjoying walking their dog, but they're really connecting to nature and understanding the impact that this much use has on a landscape, and hopefully taking home some knowledge that can help them manage their own landscapes. Maybe if you have a back meadow in your yard that's not doing very much, you could plant some plants for pollinators, something like that. Cool. So the tree planting initiative for this meadow is pretty cool. Here we see a red maple in one of these tubes. These tubes actually prevent predation by deer and rabbits and small little guys that will nibble on the buds when the tree is young and prevent it from growing up. And the goals for this tree planting initiative are wetland rehabilitation. So this is kind of a wet meadow, but the more trees that like having their feet wet and take up a lot of water that you add into this environment, then the less water there's going to be in the soils, and the less muddy it'll be, and the easier it'll be for the land to function as a wetland and help take up that runoff from groundwater. Also, bird habitat, like I mentioned, really important. And then also the action that they've done is they've planted over 1,000 native trees and shrubs of wetland species. So this one on the left is red maple. There's also some black willows, some gray birch, some dogwood. So definitely get out there. Don't be weirded out by the weird looking green tubes. They are temporary. They'll come off once the tree is old enough. But it's really great that they're doing this work. So nice job, Burlington Parks Rec and Waterfront. And now, Carrie's been waiting for this the whole time. Notable trees of Oakledge. We can't talk about notable trees of Oakledge without talking about oaks. So this is a red oak. I also thought this was a great photo because I think the notable trees at Oakledge are the trees that are or were landscape trees, right? So landscape trees or ornamentals are trees planted by humans for humans to some degree. We have this oak standing proud in the middle of the meadow, and we can see some younger trees as well. I believe this is also an oak to the left of the big one. Not totally sure what this one is from the twigs, but you can see that we're putting these out as little flags in the landscape, little aesthetically pleasing dots that break it up. Back behind the arrow, there's a big clump of green. That's a large patch of, it's a patch of several large northern white cedars. Another really beautiful tree, often used in landscapes. It's often used in hedges and stuff. Really cool stuff. But this is a red oak. We're going to start talking about some more oaks. This photo, I apologize if the red oak leaf is not as nice as the white oak leaf. It has been nibbled on a little bit. but I did find these two leaves right next to each other, and I couldn't help but take the photo. This is just a great little tip for identifying oak leaves. Essentially, there's two general types of oaks. There's the white oak and the red oak subgenus. So just real quick, we're not going to get too technical in this webinar, but the Latin name is underneath the common name on this slide. And Quercus is the first word of both red and white oak's Latin names. So that would be the genus. Then the second word is the specific epithet. So basically they're in the Quercus genus, and the species is Alba or rubra, white oak, red oak. But there is a subgenus, which is basically just, there's a bunch of white oaks that are all in the white oak subgenus. There's a bunch of red oaks that are in the red oak subgenus. It gets kind of complicated, but essentially here in Vermont, the two we see the most are white oak and red oak. They're in their own subgenuses, and they have good examples of the features that you can look for in each of their subgenuses. So sorry if that's confusing, but I will hopefully explain it more. If we look at the lobes on the white oak, and the lobes are the little things that stick out, you can see that they're fairly rounded. They might come to a little bit of a point, like a blunt-nosed point, but they are fairly rounded. And then on the red oak, especially on the far right side here, I don't know if it's flipped, but the side away from the white oak leaf, you can see there's kind of a sharp point, and at the tip of that point is a thin bristle. So this is called a bristle tip, and only red oaks or oaks in the red oak subgenus will have this bristle tip. So pretty good general tree ID feature for oaks. If it has a rounded lobe, it's probably in the white oak subgenus. If you're in Vermont, it's probably white oak, Quercus alba. If you're somewhere else, it could be a different white oak. If it has a point, it's likely in the red oak subgenus. And if you're in Vermont, it's probably red oak, could be black oak, also in the red oak subgenus. But yeah, that's leaf ID for oaks. Bark for oaks. These two trees have fairly similar bark. The red oak bark, I think, is a little bit more rigid, so you won't be able to peel it off quite as easily. Not that you should be trying to peel off bark, but just when you put your hand on it. And it also has longer vertical ridges. So the white oak seems, it's probably a product of it being a little more crumbly, but it seems like the vertical furrows have slightly more horizontal breaks in them. It's also, I think, a little bit paler. I don't really like to go off color for this type of thing for bark. I prefer to go off like texture and, you know, general features and growth trends. But generally the white oak is a little bit lighter in color. And while we're talking about oaks, and we're talking about the name of Oakledge having the word oak in it, we can't not bring up the idea of legacy trees or wolf trees. It's another term for them. So I define a legacy tree as a tree that has been present through landscape changes. So this tree to the right is a white oak that I found in the forest, kind of on the east side of Oakledge between the housing development and the parking lot. And I actually really like this patch of forest because it feels the most like a forest. I know it's like right between a parking lot and a housing development, but the rest of the landscape at Oakledge has been manicured by humans quite a bit, or it's the small area on the ledges that is forested, but as we saw in the old photos, it used to be managed in a way where there's no understory, and it's just the big white pines. And over time, as development has shifted away, and it's kind of been more leave it be type of situation in the park, the invasives have really taken over that area, and the trails have really beat down the soils. So it feels more like a park when you're in the patch of forest next to the lake on the ledges. And if you go to the east side, behind the second parking lot, there's a small loop that goes into the forest from the parking lot and comes out in the meadow. And it just feels a little bit more like a contiguous forest. So I really like it. But in this tree, you can see that there's some dead branches lower, and you can see that about like a third of the way up this tree, there's a spot where a lot of branches come off of there. And you can see that they're kind of going out fairly horizontally. So this is due to the light availability at this point in the tree's life. So trees are always trying to grow towards light, as most plants are, and if they have no competition around them, like if this tree was out in a field, much like a lot of the other oaks at Oakledge, then its branches would just go straight out, and they would kind of just keep going up, and it would be a perfect circle. It wouldn't be as much of like a tall, straight, columnar tree. I'm from Connecticut originally, and we have a lot of oaks in Connecticut, and in particular, there's the Charter Oak, which has a history with the Revolutionary War, and it's now on the quarter for Connecticut. And I always remember oaks having a nice big round canopy because the canopy of the Charter Oak just perfectly fills that quarter. So we can see, looking at this oak that does not have a perfectly round canopy, it has undergone some serious changes in terms of its light availability and the competition around us. So it once had branches that reached out laterally. Soon, more competition for light grew in. So even though these pines are taller or just as tall as the oak, they're likely quite a bit younger. They're just a fast-growing species. They're early colonizers. So when whoever stopped holding succession on this landscape stopped, they said, whatever, we're going to let these pines just grow up all around. And they actually shaded out these lower branches on the oak. So the oak decided it was going to cut off those branches. Trees are really great at just saying, you know what, you're not doing me enough good for me to continue sending you nutrients. They cut off circulation to those branches. It's called self-thinning. And you can almost see like a second spout of growth up here. So the tree assessed that it needed to take advantage of growing where there was light, which was just way up at the top of the canopy. And it put on all these branches, and you can even see in the character of the branches. You know, these lower branches are just growing straight up. They have light, or straight up and out. So they have light everywhere. And these branches up top, they really snake up. You can almost imagine them slowly growing and having like insufficient light the whole time, and growing a little to the left and then a little to the right. That's a growth pattern that we see in a lot of trees that can't handle shade. So like black cherry. If you ever see a black cherry in the woods, you look up and you can just follow its trunk as it snakes its way up. And it's really pretty. So that's why this legacy tree is especially significant, because it tells this whole story. You see the early light availability, you see the effect of the competition growing in, and then you see the tree's resilience as it creates its backup plan. But legacy trees and wolf trees come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. You'll find plenty of them out in the forests around New England. A lot of times it's like a big sugar maple that was on the edge of a field at an old homestead, or a proud oak from in front of Oakledge Manor.
We had a question come in for you. A while back, the stretch of road between the lower and upper parking lots was lined with trees on the east side of the road. Do you know what kind of trees they were and why they were taken down?
I don't know specifically. So I've only been in Burlington for about 5 years. I do know that a lot of so if you go towards that meadow, then on the, I think, east side of that road, so I think it's the bike path that goes through the meadow, there are a bunch of calorie pear trees. I'm not sure if calorie pear trees were the same tree used on the road. Depends on how far back it was and my memory, but the calorie pear tree is, I'm not sure if it's native to Vermont, but I know it's a really common street tree ornamental. I don't think that you'll find it in the forests very much, maybe southern Vermont. I think a lot of those like fruit trees kind of aren't a present part of our Vermont forests, but could grow in our environment. And that's why we can still have pear farms, probably. I'm a forest tree guy, not an ornamental tree guy. But I do know that the calorie pear is a really popular ornamental because it can withstand a lot. I think the Burlington city arborist on a field trip I had in school once said you can hit it with a car and a branch can, a part of the split trunk can fall off, and the tree can just keep living. So it could have been that there were more calorie pairs there. If that was the case, I'm okay with them being gone because I don't think that they added much to the environment as just like another ornamental tree in a very ornamental and manicured ecosystem.
Great.
Hope that answers your question as best as I can. So this tree is a really beautiful landscape tree. This is a shagbark hickory. If you look at the photo on the right, you can really see how shaggy that bark is. We can also see the gnarled appearance of the branches. When I'm doing tree ID, I pay a lot of attention to growth form. It's something that it's really hard to pay attention to, or really hard to notice and note characteristics with if you haven't been paying attention to the tree for a long time. But the longer you do tree ID and the more things you pay attention to, the more those characteristics kind of become as second nature, and you can pay attention to, oh, this is definitely a sugar maple. What's the shape of this sugar maple? How does it compare to the last sugar maple I saw? Were those in different environments? Does that play a role? These are just the type of questions that you should be asking yourself as you're going around and kind of making these naturalist speculations. It's also a great tree for wildlife. So it does drop nuts that are edible. Save them for the animals though, especially in our urban areas. Not the best to forage in areas where a lot of people are going. And also the bark is a pretty special habitat for our endangered Indiana bat. It actually, when it's growing up, it'll have the little, I think the babies will hide up underneath the shagbark, maybe the adults as well. I know bats are pretty small, but there's a couple ecosystems that are really special and rare here in Vermont because they're like on a little cliffside and there's a bunch of shagbark hickories, and it's a really special place for these animals because it's their nursing grounds or their baby's playground. They can kind of hide under the shagbark and then they can fly around, and it's I think it's a more safe environment because it's kind of tucked away on top of the hilltop. But yeah, cool tree, definitely worth knowing. Northern white cedar is also a cool tree. It's really long-lived. These individuals are fairly small, but it's worth pointing out in the photo on the bottom left, we can see the needles are very flat. So I always think of it as ironed flat, as if someone took an iron to it. And this is really a good characteristic because it's the opposite of the eastern red cedar, which we'll see a photo of in a moment, and it's the same tree that we saw in the meadow on my slide earlier. We'll also note that the bark on these white cedars really peely, long strips, and it's actually, the trunk is fairly circular. So that's another thing that differs from the red cedar generally. Things, you know, it's hard to make sweeping generalizations in nature because there's a lot of different environmental factors and nutrient factors that can affect how a tree looks. But cool tree, really long lived. There are some that are in this region, I think up in like just over the border in Montreal, that are like thousands of years old, like over 1,000 years old, which is pretty crazy. Hopefully these trees will get there someday. They're a pretty strong tree. They can hang out on these edges. This is right on the ledge where it's being battered by the wind and the elements all year long. So I think that's a pretty impressive characteristic for any tree. So here's our eastern red cedar. The photo on the right shows the kind of corally texture of the needles. So while from afar they look kind of similar, like green clumpies of needles that don't really look like traditional needles, if you get up close, it's pretty clear that the white cedar has really flat needles and the red cedar has kind of like clumpy corally needles. And we can see on the bark all the way down over here, there are these stripes. And this is just the way that this trunk often grows. On the photo in the middle, we can see the stripes kind of grow into their own feet to some degree. And this is just another way to identify red cedar versus white cedar. White cedar usually doesn't do this. Also, I don't really suggest cutting down trees just to see what they look like. But if you ever cut down a red cedar, the stump is going to look really cool. It's going to be like a bunch of lobes. I have a couple photos of ones that I found around that just a really pretty stump. And the wood is really nice too.
So the white cedar will just be sort of like your normal tree stump, like a circular thing, and this will be all like wobbly looking.
The white cedar is usually a little more round. Like I said, it's hard to make generalizations with this kind of stuff. Anything can affect the way a tree grows, but generally, this is the one with the weird loby trunk. So we have to talk about eastern white pine. Even though it is called Oakledge, I would say eastern white pine is the dominant tree. Maybe it wasn't back in the day, as I said, these are fairly fast-growing trees that have come on up and really taken over the landscape to some degree. But the top left photo is a photo of the meadow, and you can see that behind the meadow is that patch of forest I was talking about in between the parking lot and the condos that allows you to go through and see that legacy tree, as well as a little bit of like a nice foresty feeling forest. Below that, we have another photo from underneath the big Constitution signing oak, and you can see that there's just like one large, well, you can see several white pines, but one really large one sticking out. So likely that one is pretty old. It's probably from, probably you could find it in the photo of the cabins that we saw over there. And it's a really great example of how white pine operates. So we talked a little bit about shade tolerance. So remember the black cherry really can't handle shade, and it just sneaks its way up. Kind of like eastern white pine. A lot of these trees in the first photo, the top photo, they won't have many branches below that top section of the canopy. They're really just operating on that top level, getting sun. And this really old one in the lower photo on the left is what we call a dominant crown class. So it is way above the rest of the crowns of those trees. And it's just loving life, getting lots of sun.
Two questions that came in for you. This is a good point.
For sure.
Where is that big shagbark hickory located in the park relative to everything else?
So the shagbark hickory is like right in front of the pavilion. So yeah, if you're at the pavilion standing where the manor used to be and you look straight in front of you, you'll see the water kind of like straight and to the right, and then you'll see the shagbark hickory a little more to the left. It's kind of in the open, a crowded spot.
And is that white pine considered an invasive, or is it native?
White pine is native to Vermont. Yeah, just because it came in and took over the landscape doesn't mean it's non-native. It's just the character of this tree. A lot of the forests in Vermont that were just like cut down, the white pine has grown up, and it's kind of a sign that the forest is fairly young. It's going through the early stages of succession, where those fast-growing species that want to take advantage of all the available light are spending their time here. And, you know, slowly as these pines die out, like we can see in the lower photo compared to the black and white photo of that shot, or of that spot, some other trees have kind of grown in. We can see some hardwoods among the pines.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and then this photo on the right, just another pine looking kind of goofy. I think these have a very goofy growth form. They just kind of shoot branches out every which way. They look a little Dr. Seussy. And this one is to the right of the large oak that we've been talking about a bunch, so right by the water, gathering lots of light. It's probably stoked on that location. This is another native pine. So this is a pitch pine. I really like pitch pines. They have this really cool bark you can see in the kind of both photos on the left and right, where it's shiny. It has these larger plates, and then within the plates, there's like this little, I don't know, flakiness of shining red and like almost like a silvery red. Really beautiful. This tree is worth noting. This is a tree that I have two photos of, and then a shrub next to it, which is the photo in the middle. These are growing right on that jetty out to the water, and they're doing fine. So much like the northern white cedar, they can really hang out in tough situations. And if you look at the roots of this tree, the large one, it's really barely in soil. It's reaching down through the cracks in the rock. It's maybe like breaking some of those cracks open a bit more just to get something from it. But the canopy looks great. It's super dense, full of needles, has a ton of cones on it. So this tree is not hurting. It's actually thriving in this rough condition. And the shrub also, just I had to take a photo of it because it looks so lush. Yeah, so really cool type of pine, also Vermont native. So we've been talking about the trees that I like at Oakledge. Unfortunately, Oakledge is filled with quite a lot of invasive species. This is actually the bottom of our wolf tree or our legacy tree photo. And unfortunately, the understory of this forest is filled with invasives such as buckthorn, honeysuckle, and this photo here with these dark stems that bend over is all common buckthorn.
Boo.
Yeah, so we don't like common buckthorn. It was brought over as an ornamental. Maybe it was planted by the Webb family somewhere on the property. Maybe it was brought over. I think it has berries that birds really like to eat and spread. So it could have been someone in downtown Burlington had it and it soon started spreading. But it's a really big problem in a lot of our forests, especially ones like this. So these urban forests that have these previous uses where it was more cleared, we have to make sure that, you know, if we're going from a period of humans have been holding off the succession to now we're going to allow for the trees and stuff to grow in, we want to take those spaces that have a lot of light and we want to plant native trees there as opposed to allowing the sometimes more aggressive invasive species to come in and outcompete the other trees by just growing faster and having better seed dispersal mechanisms than our native species. So these photos here, they show us the twig of the buckthorn. In between that main, or that tip bud, there's like a little thorn sticking out, so that's where it gets its name. Unfortunately, I have a photo of a fairly large individual. This is probably like 4 inches in diameter, maybe 5, right below that main split. So really ugly bark. Maybe that's just my opinion because I already don't like them, but I think it's a pretty ugly bark. And the growth form also is not the most aesthetically pleasing. So maybe it looks better. Maybe it looked better a couple hundred years ago when they were, or 150 years ago when they were popular ornamentals. But as you can see, as it gets older, it gets this like witch broomstick looking feature. And from the last photo, you can see that it's not a very strong wood, and a lot of times it just bends over from its own weight. And it creates these interesting structures that are great for, you know, bunnies to run through and some aspects of the wildlife. But ultimately, it's just outcompeting our native species, and the animals that have evolved over years and years to eat the berries of our native species are suddenly only given buckthorn and honeysuckle and these other invasives, and it's really, you know, disturbing the way that they're used to living. So that's why we want to be careful about invasive species. So this is honeysuckle. It's a little bit harder to take a photo of. It has a lighter bark, much thinner twigs. It grows as like a, I'd say like medium to large shrub. So the one on the left is like up to chest height, and then the ones in the photo on the top right, these are all like head height and above with the, I guess I could call it canopy that spans like 6 to 10 feet. So they really, you know, they start from a small base and they just sprawl out. You know, I like the photo here with the chimney because it kind of shows us that this whole area was cleared. There is a cabin to the right of this off the photo, but likely, you know, you walk out your cabin, there's a few stately pines around and you have a nice view and you sit on your patio. And over time, that open space and the compacted soils that our native species can't handle as well as these invasives, they just invited all of these invasive species to come in. And it's really sad walking along the ledges if you know what invasives are, because they're really everywhere. Oriental bittersweet is another one. I think this is the one that I don't know if I hate it the most, but I like it aesthetically the most, but I definitely dislike it as an invasive. It has these cute little berries. In the photo on the left, you can see they have like a little like leaf or a little cap that's orange. So it's this nice orange and red berry on a vine. Unfortunately, the vine really likes to twist itself around the trunks of trees, and it actually chokes them and prevents them from sending water and nutrients up and down their trunks. And this effectively kills the trees. So not a great invasive, although it does look pretty. And at least on this one, I can somewhat understand why you'd want to bring it over. It looks pretty. The buckthorn, I just don't get. So that's pretty much all we've got. I've got just the last little photo here of these trees. So I just want to say that these dead trees are just as much a functional part of the ecosystem as the living trees. This especially, you know, we see there's a bunch of holes in these trees. They're home to little animals that burrow in there and birds that peck these out and insects that are burrowing. So really important habitat. We've got the standing deadwood, and we also have the downed woody debris. And both of these kind of provide different niche habitats. Downed woody debris has more decomposers going in, and that changes the way that other insects and other animals can use that wood. But the standing woody debris is kind of a more rare and valuable habitat for birds and other creatures. So really important that we acknowledge all the awesome things that Burlington Parks, Rec, and Waterfront are doing to keep this a diverse property and an educational property, since it is here in the heart of Burlington. We need to respect these ecosystems, so stay on trails, give wildlife lots of space, and leave no trace. A special thanks to Burlington Parks, Rec, and Waterfront, and also the UVN Library Special Collections for all those great photos. It was really great to have all those. And if you're interested in learning more about the natural world, I do nature hikes with Petrocliffs Climbing Gym and Mountaineering School. We're just trying to foster a deeper appreciation of the landscape that we're often recreating in. So you can go to petrocliffs.com/nature-based programming. Our next hikes are socially distant outdoor hikes at the Arms Forest, where we're going to be talking about winter tree ID. I also have another webinar here on March 13th, where we're going to be doing a virtual walk through Ethan Allen Park. We'll also be doing tree ID there.
Yeah, and if people have questions, feel free to submit them in the chat. We can hang out for a few more minutes if there are some last minute questions. I do have one coming in. Someone asked, are there any other smaller pines like the pitch pine in Vermont? Any info on needles, cone size, etc.?
All right, that's a big question. We do have other pines in Vermont. The one that's most like the pitch pine is the red pine. Biggest differences, I'd say red pine doesn't have the larger plates on its bark. So you'll look at a red pine and it'll have more of those like flaky, shinier bark sections and fewer of like the chunks that pitch pine has. I call them plates. And within those plates, there's like a slightly different but similar in a way section of like chunky flakes. But the red pine just won't have the plates. It'll just be all like exfoliating chunky flakes. And then the biggest difference, the cones look pretty similar on those two, but if you go to the twig of the needle bundle of the pine, the red pine is going to have 2 needles attached to what's called a fascicle, a little bundler at the bottom, and then a pitch pine is going to have 3 needles. So that's a pretty solid thing to check when you're delineating between red pine and pitch pine. We also have the Austrian black pine around here, but that is an ornamental tree that's non-native. You'll see it in plantations sometimes, like out in old forests that used to be homesteads, and you'll see it a lot in like downtown Burlington, UVM campus. But in terms of native growing pines, I think that's all we've got. And the pitch pine, I wouldn't say that it's a small growing pine. I would say it grows in rough situations where sometimes its size is limited. But if you go to the right spot, you can find some humongous, awesome pitch pines. And also if you go to the right spot, like on top of a ridge or on the little jetty out in Oakledge, you'll find some pretty small ones that are fairly limited by their resources and their habitat to be able to grow too much more.
Great. bunch of people just saying thank you, great presentation, no other questions coming in. For the person who asked if it's going to be recorded, yes, I have been recording this and I will post it on our website in the future. It might take us a while to get it up, but it will be recorded for your review. So I will leave the question and answer box up for just another minute or two in case there's anybody furiously typing away, trying to get their question in there, but otherwise, thank you all so much for attending today. Really appreciated your presence. It's fun to have these classes even when we can't gather together in person. And I'll be sending a class survey out probably on Monday, just wanting to know your thoughts on the class and ideas for other classes you'd like to see. Like Jean mentioned, we've got another webinar coming up with us on Saturday, March 13th about Ethan Allen Park. So we're excited for that one. But I don't see any more questions coming in, so I will go ahead and end our live stream today. Thank you, Jean, and thank you all so much for coming. Have a great rest of your weekend.